8 passions, and the West they talk about the 7 deadly sins, which is a very similar list. What I, especially in putting together a life confession, but generally as a kind of a guide for confession, just to prepare yourself, because we need to go on a weekly basis or every other week, is to examine ourselves and look and see where we've fallen on these things. So gluttony, it's not just about overeating; it's any misuse of food, of alcohol, of substances. Anything about the gratification of our taste, it has, and there's all sorts of things associated with lust. That's everything from carnal thoughts to self-gratification of whatever way, and fornication, adultery, and this is kind of getting more and more excommunicable. Incest, pedophilia, any of that. Some people want to, will come to confession and just say, well, I struggle with lust. I say, oh, okay. So, does that mean self-gratification? Does that mean adultery? Does that mean bestiality? Does it mean incest? So, what kind of lust are you talking about? Is it something that, does it mean you have carnal thoughts? Or that you've really gone? So this is where it's important, I think, to be a little bit more specific without going into details. Anger. Of course, all of these are a spectrum. Mm-hmm. Anger is anywhere from getting irritated or being irritable, to being angry with somebody, to holding resentment, to hating somebody, to murder, or hurt, or some other kind of thing. Avarice, it's not only about money, it's not only greed, but it's being completely obsessed with money, it's and with material things. Our culture is possessed by avarice. It's avaricious by definition, because it's all about money and stuff.
I would say that's closely to gluttony when you say pretty close.
Yeah, it's very close. But gluttony is very specific because it's these have pairs that go with it. So one of the remedies for gluttony is fasting. Of lust is chastity. Of anger, sobriety of mind. Of avarice is non-acquisitiveness. Of despondency is joy. What is the polar? Not just the polar opposite, but the healing. The healing of envy is envy or jealousy. It's to pray for the person and to love the other, right? Vainglory. Now another side of, and each of these also has an opposite kind of, like vainglory is seeking for praise and being obsessed with how you look and how how you present yourself and all of this, and it's all external. But the polar opposite, which is also part of the passion of vainglory, is self-pity. And pride, obviously, has many different manifestations, but it's obsession with oneself, with the ego, right? But what's the opposite is toxic shame. So toxic shame is actually pride. It's actually a form of pride.
What's despondency?
Despondency is the whole spectrum that goes from being lazy to kind of dissatisfied, unhappy kind of thing, towards depression and despair and nihilism.
Would that be like a replacement of like slothfulness?
Slothfulness,
It's
yeah.
like a replacement of that?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the same thing, just a different word. And so it's really, so when we examine ourselves, and like for a life confession, you might go through and think about, well, when I was in grade school, or when I was in junior high school, or high school, or when I was in college, or when I was at this age, or that, go through and think about, did I abuse food? Did I abuse drugs? Did I abuse, And so, what would you call it? The binge purge thing? That's actually a form of gluttony. It's all about gluttony because it's an obsession with food and a misuse of food. Last we can pretty much answer for any of those different ages, right? What about anger? So if we have anger, if we have resentments, and some of those resentments can be pretty old. Well, what was it that caused those resentments? And what is it? And so and so there's other kinds of so for fasting, right? Lust is chastity. Anger is sobriety. Non-acquisition. I'm trying to think of what would be the kind of way to heal envy.
I would either say, I guess, for envy or pride, I would say humility. I don't know why I keep saying that, but
Yeah, well, actually, for all of these. Humility. Oops. Well, humility, sobriety. Sober-mindedness. And so, we think about, there's another thing. We each have a kind of a major passion that afflicts us. And it's good to identify that and look at how it developed in our lives. And when did it start, and how did it get nurtured, or how did it get provoked? For people who've had a rough time, anger is usually the chief passion. For people who have been would be anger, sometimes avarice, despondency, envy. Vainglory and pride are pretty much universal. But for example, a craving for praise, a craving for acknowledgement. That's usually all about vainglory. But it might be rooted in something else. You see, this is why it's important, especially in a life confession, to tell the story, tell the story of your life. In other words, who are you? You know, how did you arrive at being you as you are today, and what are the issues that need to be dealt with, and especially what is it that needs to be healed? Is it anger? Is it resentment? Is it some kind of addiction? Is it some kind of is it arrogance? Is it depression? And why? You know, and what are these things? Because the more you can identify them and objectify them, you already gain control over them. And that's an amazing thing. Yeah.
Speaking of healing, is there confessions?
Confession, yeah, usually during the service.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're subject to the class.
Got you.
So along with this, one of the things that really afflicts a lot of people is resentment. And the resentment often comes from having either been abused, neglected, or mistreated as a child, and starting with childhood and onwards. In some people, it's so deep that it's from a pre-verbal stage. And so it basically just shows up as toxic shame and self-hatred. And one of the things I found in my research is that, of course, it's totally politically incorrect, is the effect of daycare on young children. It's a disaster. And because you think about it, I mean, especially little babies, 8 weeks old, 10 weeks old, you can tell them whatever you want to tell them, and it doesn't mean anything because the tone of voice might mean something, but they can't process words. And so you drop them off at daycare and it doesn't matter that, oh, mommy will be back in just a few hours. All they know is, mommy has abandoned me. I must not be worth anything. I must be a piece of garbage. Now, these are, of course, are not the only sins. I think we could also and this is the real task of the spiritual life. So, egotism and selfishness. Of course, egotism and selfishness are precisely connected to vainglory and pride. they're also connected to envy. It's also connected to envy. It's all about poor me, so the self-pity of vainglory is the poor me of envy. I don't have that nice new Mercedes like my friend Maddie does. Oh, that beautiful new Mercedes just. Or so egotism and selfishness. There's self-love. The Greek word self-love is philophtia. And what it means is, it's like pride, it's inordinate concentration on the self, but not on the true self, on the false self. And so it's all about the ego. The ego is our false self that we have created and that we project to the world. It's how we want people to think about us. It's the image that we want to project. It's how we think of ourselves and how we are afraid people think of ourselves. It's all of our fears and wrapped up with all of our pride and vainglory and all of our fantasies and all of this other stuff that we project. And so the ego becomes this kind of, for most of us, it's the operative. It's the operating system by which we deal with the world, but it's not our true self. Our true self is in the nous. It's on the much deeper level, and it usually doesn't have a whole lot to do with the ego and egotism, and the egoistic kind of self. Selfishness, of course, is a kind of, well, it's a very blatant, doing everything my way, according to myself, for my benefit, looking out for number one, all this stuff. But the fathers, like St. Maximus the Confessor, talks about self-love, philophtia, as the core and essence of all sin. And it certainly is. Self-gratification in food, self-gratification in sex, ego gratification in anger, self-justification and all of that kind of stuff. Avarice, I want more stuff for me so that I can, so that people can see, that I'm a rich guy and I can, I've got all this money and I've got all this power and we don't see it so blatantly very often, but just turn on TV and then it's absolutely blatant, Despondency is also egotistical and selfish, right? Because what happens? You become totally focused in on yourself, and then it just goes round, spirals around and round and round and round, and you lose sight of other people. You lose sight of God. You lose sight of even your true self, and you just get lost in the kind of ego, ultimately recognizing the inadequacy of your own self-concept, not yourself, but your self-concept, which is what the ego is. Envy. Why should that person have that when I don't? It's all about me. Why did that person get that job with so much bigger salary than I deserve, and I deserve that, and on and on and on and on. envy, vainglory, and pride is just obvious. And so we have to look at our inner motivations, ultimately. And this is very helpful. It sometimes could be painful, but we have to look at our inner motivations. Another thing is resentment. So, abuse, pain, anger. When we perceive that we're being abused, whether we are or not, sometimes what we take as abuse. I know a kid who charged his mother with child abuse because she took away his smartphone for a couple of hours.
Did he win?
What?
Did he
No.
win? Okay, good.
Mental distress or something.
He needed his butt paddled is what he needed.
I feel like this could, the resentment and this could come up and creep up on it out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're not vigilant.
Yep. And, well, the thing is, it takes a while for resentments to develop. Say somebody hurt.
It's like if you express, that someone might be like, well, you're keeping a tally almost.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But with abuse or with getting, however, usually somebody hurts you and you don't really resent tripping over a rock or something like that, or crashing. You might resent crashing your car, but then you're the one that you resent, not not the. I mean, it's a personal thing, right? It's always personal. But there's hurt involved, and the hurt and the pain. Actually, hurt should be under pain. Is the source of anger, and the anger very often turns into objectification. That person is a dangerous person. That person is, they're going to hurt you. That person is, is evil. That person is, and what we do is we take it's like taking a snapshot of a person at that time, at that stage in their life. So it wouldn't work for you, but maybe 30 years ago, somebody did. I like to use the example of, a guy whose girlfriend dumped him in high school, and Mr. Super Jock, Mr. Muscles, came up and just swept her away, and she never gave another thought to him, and so he was hurt by that, and so he became angry, and he was angry at her, but he was more angry at the other guy, right? So he formed a resentment, and so he objectified him, and so whenever the thought of that guy came up, he would see him as a I don't know, beefy 18-year-old or something like that, and so he would be angry at him and probably wish him ill and slander him and all of these other things, which both internally and to other people. So it builds up this whole kind of thing around it, and then we self-justify. say, oh, that guy, he's, you know, he's really nasty, he's really evil, he's dangerous, he's, so it's only right, you know, that to tell people to stay away from him, because I'm doing society a favor by telling people that this guy is dangerous and this guy is, and on and on and on and on, right? So of course these are egotism, and think of all the other passions that would be hit in this. Okay, guy gets his girlfriend taken away, so maybe not gluttony, but definitely lust, right? Anger, avarice. Women are expensive, right? Despondency threw him into you know, depression, you know, that he lost his girlfriend. Envy, because he envies the guy who took his girlfriend until he does this whole same process and resents her as well. Oh, she wasn't any good. She was, and so on, so on, so on. Vainglory. He has his pride hurt. Well, part of that is vainglory, and part of that is actually pride. He doesn't have this chick who he looks really good with, you know, and somehow she, or rather she looks good, and, you know, just him being by her makes him look good, and vainglory, you know, stupid vainglory, right? And pride, you know, I got this girl and she had been my, you know, she was the best girl in the class, you know. And so it touches all of, except for maybe gluttony, right? And what that does is the resentment puts out roots into all the passions. And so when that person's name is mentioned, or you catch sight of him, like in a store or something, and what it does is it triggers a reaction, right? Or you hear him mentioned on the radio or something. And so what happens? You react to that buried resentment. Even though, well, if there's a trigger like that, but if the trigger is something that only reminds you of that person, you can be reacting to. And that's what happens when we react totally out of proportion to our to the stimulus. So, for example, you know, I use LA as an example. You know, so if you are trying to get off the freeway and you cut somebody off and the guy pulls up next to you and shoots you, that's probably a bit of an overreaction for cutting somebody off, right? A bit. Yeah. Very LA. But so, and that person was undoubtedly, you know, possessed by resentment and hatred and all of that, and what you did just triggered him, and then he triggered you, and well, it worked. That wasn't pre-planned. But
so is there a way though that if something happened to you in your past and you did have resentment and it did lead to the anger, but then you were good at hiding it, but then certain things were said that was able to cause you to like bawl your eyes out or to feel really bad about it, but then you got to a certain age where it's like the anger kind of dissipated, but like the hurt's still there because of what happened, but you're not angry at the person. It's like you forgive the person, but like the hurt doesn't always instantly go away.
right, but you can forgive the hurt too, because actually you're not just forgiving the incident, you're forgiving the person. Oops. Okay. Anyway. So anyway, that's how that works. And to get away from it. Okay, so let me finish the story about the guy and his girlfriend. So 30 years later, the guy pulls up in his new BMW sedan to the gas station, and who walks out to pump the gas? Mr. Superjock, who's 30 now gray and grizzly, and 35, 30 years later, and he can't even recognize him. And how can and if he still reacts, he's never dealt with his resentment. And if he doesn't react, that means maybe he's matured a little bit over those 30 years. But the whole point of this is that resentment is dealt with by forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean to validate what happened. It doesn't mean to say it was okay. Because if there was abuse or something like that involved, it's never okay. It's never okay to abuse somebody. And it's never okay to simply to accept it. To say, oh, I deserved it or something like that. You never deserve to be abused. No one ever deserves to be abused. And so, what is forgiveness? The process of forgiveness is to look at what happened and to see what did the other person do, and then how did you respond? And at first, everything is totally enmeshed, right? But then, as you pull them apart, you can see clearly what the other person did and how you reacted. And what we need to do is we need to let the other person's sin be the other person's sin. There's nothing we can do about it. But we also need to take responsibility for our reaction. So if we got angry, if we slandered the person, if we hated the person, if we resented them, and on and on and on, right? We can repent of that. And we can ask forgiveness. And then it's not quite so daunting. The other person still has their stuff to deal with. But as long as we maintain a victim stance, they are in control. And we yield power to them, the person who abused us, which is usually the last thing you want to do, right? And this works on the personal level. It works on the social level. So it's all about forgiveness. And of course, forgiveness is one of the primary, it's one of the primary themes of the gospel. So that we can live in a state of complete reconciliation with everyone. That's the goal. And to forgive does not mean to say, as I said, it doesn't mean to say it was all right or I deserve. It means to say, yes, I recognize that you did these things, but I can overlook them and see another person just like me who's struggling. And what that does is it opens the gate to be able to love them. That doesn't mean that you have to become best friends or anything like that. Doesn't mean you even have to have contact with them. but it removes the barrier, and then you can pray for them. So forgiveness is ultimately fulfilled by praying for the people that have hurt you. So, Brother Michael will be bringing icons of Mother Olga tonight that we had printed up. That icon was written by a woman that I know, and she was one of the first people Mother Olga appeared to. And she had been born in a brothel and raised in a brothel and was stuck there until she was 21 in New York City. And of course, she was a mess by that time. And then she found Orthodoxy, and that was very, incredibly powerful thing for her life. But then one night she had a very vivid dream, kind of dream vision,
Like lucid dream?
a lucid dream, in which this little tiny Oriental-looking lady, about yay high, who didn't speak English, came and loved her and led her by the hand into what she later found out was a traditional Yupik house, Yupik Eskimo house, because Mother Olga was Yupik, which was a log cabin covered by sod out into the tundra, out the back door of the house, to the Mother of God who was there, who healed her. And she found that this was Matushka Olga. Well, eventually it got around that there were many other women who had suffered various kinds of abuse, who had been visited by Mother Olga. And so this huge veneration of her has arisen. But the lady but the icon that I have was written by this woman who had that vision, that first vision of her, at least the first one that we know of. And it's very, when I went up to Alaska to do a panakita at her grave, the icon was on the grave, and then it was given to me, which was a rather nice gift, I dare say. But she was also a midwife, as well as the wife of the priest in the village, and that was and she worked with the needy, the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Of course, in Native American communities that had been devastated by alcohol, and so there were lots and lots of widows and lots of orphans. People would kill themselves drinking, or they would go into despair and go out on the snowmobile into the snowstorm and never be found again. But Mother Olga was a person who brought hope and who brought joy to those people. And she was a mom. She had six kids. I met all of them. And when my assistant was holding the icon, when people were coming up, kiss the icon, and then get a blessing, a couple of the ladies gave the icon a big smooch and said, "That's my mom." Can you imagine? Anyway, so it's important, very important, to take a personal inventory of resentments and to work on them. And forgiveness does not mean that it doesn't diminish you at all. In fact, it raises you up. Because all the self-justifications are just ego. We can't hate anybody. It's not allowed. So any questions on this?
Actually, you said something about presenting yourself. Could you elaborate on what that have to look like?
Yeah, well, when you do an inventory of resentments, you also need to look, because very often we resent ourselves and we resent God. We blame God for all sorts of stuff. And, somehow, so many people have this very kind of mechanical idea of God, that he manipulates everyone and everything, and he's given us freedom and free will. I mean, and so, well, bad things happen, and most 99% of it. Sometimes it's the demons, but most of the time the demons don't need any help. It's just our brokenness that creates most of the pain and the problems and the horrible things that happen.
But like, would you have to forgive yourself, and where is the line with like self-love with that?
You have to forgive yourself. Well, this is an unhealthy self-love that's connected to egotism. There's a healthy self-love, which is a self-acceptance, and an acceptance that God created you and that God loves you. And that's which is the polar opposite of this, of selfishness and egotism. Because it's true. that's why it misses the mark. You have to accept and give thanks to God that He made you who you are, and recognize that is an aspect of His love for you, and all of the good things and all the beautiful things in life that have happened, you give thanks to God for. And when we can do that, then all of that self-hatred and self-pity and all it just goes away. Because the reality is God created us. He brought us into being because he loves us, and he wants to be in communion with us. He wants us to know Him. He wants us to share His life. And so it's this great gift of Himself to us. And that's what our life is. It's a share in the life of God. And that's an awesome thing. And so, all the self-hatred and self-loathing and all of that kind of stuff is just, it's just contrary to the essential reality of who we are and why we were made. And it doesn't work.